and to speak to the value a little bit of the opposite, I agree that for the most part, having more options never hurts. And, one of the most memorable experiences I have is like a new DM being like, standard array, no feats, no multi-classing. Do what you can with what you have in the player's handbook. And part of that was like him wanting to like not really get too complicated as he's learning what the other side of the screen looks like. But from a player perspective, it was a really interesting challenge to now be like, you can't just make super hyper optimized everything by having feat chains and, spells from Xanathars and Tashas and frost fingers from Ice Maiden. Like it was a really interesting challenge, and it was almost freeing in a way to just be like, oh, just make a half-orc barbarian, go. It simplified the character creation process in a way where there was a lot of fun in that way, and I don't want to discount that either. There might be times where it's more appropriate, or let's say you want to run a generic experience, like you want to see what that would look like, You might also say, we're not going to use Tasha's for this because we're going to try something different, And at the same time, I do agree that a lot of what we call the old guard are getting very upset at some of these options unnecessarily, because it's like, if you don't like it, just don't use it for your table. Like, why do you not liking it have to mean I can't like it? And of course, it's not bad to have a starkly different opinion, because what it does is it offers the opportunity to examine your own values and to just look at it from a different way. And also just learning how not to be super defensive is the other side of it. There's a huge value in letting them speak their mind without you having to judge your perspective of it either. But that's neither here nor there.
There was something that you mentioned there, that Adventurers League, I should preface this with that. I have no experience with Adventurers League. I've never played in it, never done anything like that. It sounds interesting, but I'm also kind of busy doing all my other stuff as a DM. So yeah, but you mentioned Adventurers League and how it's trying to homogenize an experience so that everyone can have the same one and create like consistent outcomes, I guess would be the answer there. Whereas the home campaigns, sometimes they can be hit or miss. Sometimes they can be hit or miss, or at least they can have their highs and lows, and then it still averages out if you look at it from a whole. But not everyone might get like close to the same experience, I guess you could say. So I think there's pros and cons to both. You might, in a homebrew campaign, you might have a really great, wonderful experience, like better than you've ever had or something like that, and way better than the Adventurers League could produce, just with their basic rule set there. But at the same time, you might also have like really low like moments where it's like, that didn't turn out quite how I wanted. Which might be quote unquote lower than the Adventurers League standard. So just looking at it from like a statistics mindset, how it averages out and stuff, it's interesting to me, because in the end, if you look at the big picture, you're still having a good time overall. But there's more room for fluctuation and variability in a homebrew game, which I think is always more fun to me.
Sorry, just before we move on, I did find the passage I think Adam was thinking of. The one thing to note is it is not a defined section. So there's not like a section that says the DM is the final say. It's like a little blurb inside of a bigger section, which is Worlds of Adventure.
Yeah,
where it says your
over.
DM might set the campaign on a world or on one that he or she created. Because there is so much diversity among the worlds of D&D, you should check with your DM about any house rules that will affect your play of the game, because ultimately the Dungeon Master is the authority of the campaign and its setting, even if the setting is a published world. And, I do think that in Tasha's, at the very beginning, so under the using this book, it does start with, even before the character creation, it's got to the 10 rules to remember, the first being that the DM adjudicates the rules, that the rules of D&D covers many of the twists and turns that come up in play. but the possibilities are so vast that the rules can't cover everything. So when you encounter something that the rules don't cover, the DM decides how to proceed, aiming for a course that brings the most enjoyment to your whole group. And I love that more, because it's not the DM is the final say. Players, you should shut up and listen to the DM. Snap, 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 snap. It's like, no, the DM's job is to produce an experience that will lead to the most amount of enjoyment, you know? Even if they adjudicate the rule properly, if it does not lead to the most amount of enjoyment at the table, which sometimes means it's against the players, against the player side, then they're also not doing their job well, you know? So I like how it's a both and. Like, the DM has final authority, but also, why are we here? We're not here to just argue about rules and then the DM wins every time. We are here to produce an enjoyable, memorable experience that the DM is the adjudicator of.
That's good to point out. I also enjoyed finding that as the third paragraph in this whole book. So that's definitely a good point to bring out, especially because there's so many comments on Facebook and Reddit where there are people saying it sounds like you made God mad or something like that, because a player is complaining about something that happened to their character in a game that they felt is unfair, which probably was unfair because, like we've always said, you shouldn't have an antagonistic relationship with your DM. But yeah, I think it's important to note that the language matters in this little section here, that they adjudicate the rules. That doesn't mean they set the rules. They can. I'm not saying they can't. I'm just saying that when you encounter something that the rules don't cover, if you're unsure how to interpret a rule, the DM decides how to proceed, aiming for a course that brings the most enjoyment of the whole group, just like you said. And I think that it's a little, it is, even that is interpretive, because it uses soft language like aiming or unsure, interpret, things like that, that allow you to have some wiggle room as a DM for how you want to run your games, but it doesn't mean that you are the lord and master of your entire world. There's a big misconception, I feel, that comes from the old editions of D&D where the DM decides everything. Even in some editions, I'm pretty sure the DM rolled for you whenever they asked you.
Yeah, there's some legacies that the DM just rolls for everyone, and he knows all everyone's bonuses, or the players were just narrative turnkeys, and then you would roll and tell them what happened. And
yeah.
And you can actually trace this, now that you mentioned soft language. You can trace D&D's legacy and the DM player relationship through a lot of interesting permutations. So in original D&D, the dungeon master was really even more of an authority, so and the antagonistic relationship was something that was expected. That was part of gameplay. So original Tomb of Horrors was Gary Gygax being mean to his players, so, and it wasn't about heroism. It wasn't about telling a great story. It was about, can we outthink each other? Third edition tried to codify every single possibility, which bred the habit of rules lawyering. That's really where rules lawyering came out, is that if we have every rule available, now I as the player can call you as the DM out for your lack of knowledge by referencing something official in a book. So the power was taken away from the DM and given to the players because everything was much more codified. And then you get back to 5th edition where it's really, the DM should have final say. But now that's starting to go back to the antagonistic thing of the DM is the one, everyone else shuts up when the DM talks because they're most important, And this, I think, is a better rebalancing, which is asking the question, why are we here? We're here to have fun and enjoy ourselves. The DM has their role to play in that. The players have their role to play in that. And really, this is more of a don't gum up the works entry, I feel like. Hey, players, when you're the DM, you get to do this, but right now you're not. So they're going to pick a course of action, again, that has the most amount of enjoyment, even if that most amount of enjoyment is asking the players how they want it ruled, you know? How many times does that happen where it's like, I forget how climbing works. Hey, you, like, encyclopedia of the rules. Like, how does climbing work? And then you tell them. And then now as the DM, they get to make a choice. Am I going to go rules as written, or am I going to make a circumstantial ruling, because that will increase the amount of enjoyment at my table?
Yeah, and there is one thing that's pretty interesting. I think we as DM Sharathoughts have made a pretty cool statement that we're making a shift from the old definition of dungeon master to this newer one where it's more Eastern philosophy inspired, where dungeon masters are showing mastery in the game, in producing the game and creating the setting and stuff, as opposed to being the lord of the dungeon or something like that. And so I think that's a pretty good point to bring up, just to solidify some lingering thoughts about that I have. Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon, and please, game responsibly.